The Montana wind carries the smell of coming snow across 90 miles of open country before it reaches the ridge. On that ridge stands a log cabin of dark timber and pale stone. Smoke rises from the chimney. Nothing moves in the yard. Inside, a woman in a gray wool dress lays 6 documents on a rough wooden table. Her hands do not shake. They should. What she has written down on those pages could burn this valley to the ground before spring. 60 miles south, a Denver-built carriage rolls out of a warm hotel and turns north. The wheels bite frozen mud. Inside sits a man in a fur-collared coat who has waited 20 years for this ride. He does not look at the window. He looks at his hands. Between them lies a small stand of aspen. 2 headstones. A story no one has told for 8 winters. A stagecoach rounds the last bend into a town called Copper Hollow, and the woman on it does not know yet. She had 11 days on that stage to imagine the man she was going to marry. She never imagined there would be 3. The stage rolled into Copper Hollow at 3:30 on a Thursday in late October 1878. Winifred Ashton pressed her palm flat against the window glass. Cold. So cold it burned through thin travel glove. Outside, the Montana sky held that shade of blue that only comes in the mountains. The kind of blue that makes a woman from Ohio understand for the first time in her life how small she really is. 11 days. 11 days on that stage. Her back ached. Her ankles were swollen. Her hair, which she had pinned up so carefully at the last way station, had loosened around her temples in a way she knew was not proper. She did not care, because she had arrived. The driver called down through the roof. Something about baggage. Something about the wind coming down off the pass. She did not fully hear him. Her eyes were locked on the wooden platform outside the window. On the 2 men standing there. 2. Not 1. Her stomach folded neatly in half like a letter being tucked into an envelope. The letter from the agency had been very clear. 1 man, 1 rancher, 1 name. Ephraim Ambrose, 35 years of age, widower, sound of body, sound of mind, in possession of a working homestead in Silver Pine Ridge, Montana territory. The letter had said 1 man. The platform held 2. Winifred took a long breath through her nose. She smoothed the navy blue wool of her traveling dress. She checked the small cameo brooch at her collar. She lifted her chin the way her mother had taught her before her mother died. Chin up, shoulders back. A lady does not enter a room, she arrives. The stage door opened. The younger of the 2 men reached up his hand. How was not what she had imagined. None of the men she had imagined for 11 days on a stage had looked like this. He was tall. He was broad through the shoulders in the way that only comes from real work, not the padded shoulders of St. Louis clerks. His hair was the color of dark honey where the sun caught it. His eyes were pale, pale gray, almost silver, and he was smiling at her. That was the part that undid her. He was smiling. Because in 11 days of stages and dust and cold coffee and boarding houses with thin walls, no one had smiled at her that way. Not once. Miss Ashton, he said. Yes. I am Josiah Ambrose. She took his hand. She stepped down. Her boot touched the wooden platform, and something inside her chest gave a small, quiet click like a door latch settling into its keeper. The older man had not moved. I was standing 4 feet back with his arms crossed inside his heavy coat. He was watching her the way a man watches weather he is not sure will hold. Not unfriendly, not friendly either. Just watching. This is my brother Gideon, Josiah said. Gideon Ambrose tipped his hat, barely. Ma'am, Mr. Ambrose. I was 32, she remembered from what the agency had not told her. Because the agency had not told her about him at all. His eyes were darker than Josiah's. His jaw was harder. His whole person had the quality of a man who did not waste words because he did not waste anything. She waited. She had been trained by her father to wait. Doctors learned it early. You waited for the fever to break. You waited for the patient to speak. You waited because rushing a wounded thing only made it bleed worse. She waited, and Josiah's smile faltered, just at the edges, just enough. Miss Ashton, he said, I need to tell you something before we go any further. All right, my brother Ephraim. Yes, he is not here. I can see that. He is not here because... He stopped. He looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at the ground. Josiah dropped down onto one knee in the mud of the depot platform. Winifred's breath caught in her throat. Because grown men did not kneel in mud in front of strangers. Not in her experience. Not ever. Miss Ashton, I wrote the letter to the agency. I wrote it in my brother's name. My brother Ephraim does not know that you are coming. My brother Ephraim does not know that you exist. The platform went very quiet. Somewhere behind her, a horse blew air through its nose. The wind moved through the depot sign, and the sign creaked once on its iron hinge. A child laughed in the street beyond. Winifred stared down at the young man kneeling in the mud in front of her. She thought, she should be furious. She should turn around. She should step back into that stagecoach and demand to be returned to Ohio. Except Ohio held nothing for her now. Ohio held her father's grave and a small rented room in a dressmaker's shop where she had been sewing seams for 8 months to save the coach fare. Ohio was the past, and this platform, this cold Montana platform with 2 strangers on it, was where she had chosen to arrive. She looked at Josiah Ambrose. She looked at his silver eyes, which were now full of the fear of a young man who had done something well-meaning and terrible. Get up, she said quietly. Miss Ashton, Mr. Ambrose, get up out of the mud. You will ruin your trousers, and I do not know if your brother owns another pair. Josiah blinked. Gideon, standing 4 feet back, made a small sound that was almost a laugh but was mostly surprise. Josiah stood. Now, Winifred said, take me home. We will speak to your brother together. Josiah opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Yes, ma'am, he said. Gideon lifted her trunk off the top of the coach without being asked. He carried it like it weighed nothing. It weighed everything she owned. He set it in the bed of their wagon and he tied it down with a rope in 3 efficient motions. She climbed up onto the bench. Josiah climbed up beside her. Gideon took the reins. The wagon pulled out of Copper Hollow with the whole town watching because a stage was an event and a woman off a stage was a bigger event. And a woman off a stage headed for the Ambrose homestead was the biggest event any of them would see that week. Winifred did not look back at the town. She looked forward at the mountains. She had never seen mountains before, not real ones. Ohio had hills. Missouri had bluffs. St. Louis, when she had lived there, had smokestacks. But Montana had mountains, and they rose up out of the horizon like the shoulders of something enormous that had been sleeping for a long time and was only now beginning to remember its own body. Winifred pressed her hand against her chest over the small, hard shape of the locket she wore beneath her collar. Inside the locket was a photograph. She had not told anyone about the photograph. Not yet. The wagon climbed. For an hour and a half, the road climbed. It moved along a creek that ran cold and silver over pale stones. It passed through stands of pine that grew so tall, Winifred had to tip her head back to see their tops. The air changed as they climbed. Thinner, sharper, cleaner than any air she had ever breathed. Nobody spoke. Gideon drove. Josiah looked at his hands. Winifred looked at everything. They came around a bend, and the homestead rose out of the trees the way a secret rises out of a long silence. It was not what she had expected. The letter had described a working homestead. She had imagined something like the farms of Ohio. Painted wood, a porch, a garden gone to seed for winter. This was different. This was a log cabin that had grown out of the mountain like it had always been there. 2 stories, a stone chimney that looked as if it had been built by hands that meant it to last, a barn behind with smoke curling up from the smokehouse, a corral with 3 horses in it, their winter coats already thick. And beyond all of it, the mountain itself rising up in a shoulder of dark timber and pale rock. There was a man in the yard. He was chopping wood. He had his back to the wagon. He was tall, taller than either of his brothers. His shoulders were broader in the way that spoke of years, not months. He wore no coat despite the cold, only a heavy wool shirt rolled to the elbows. The axe rose. The axe fell. A round of pine split cleanly and dropped into the snow, and he reached for another. He did not turn around. He had heard the wagon a long time before it came into the yard. Winifred knew this, because a man does not chop wood with that rhythm unless he is trying not to hear something else. Gideon pulled the wagon to a stop. The axe rose. The axe fell. Josiah cleared his throat. The axe rose. The axe fell. Please. The axe rose. It stopped in the air. Ephraim Ambrose turned around. Winifred forgot how to breathe. Not because he was handsome, although he was in the way of hard mountain country. Not because he was tall. Not because of the faint scar at his temple that she recognized instantly professionally as an old wound from a rifle butt or a fall. She forgot how to breathe because of his eyes. His eyes were gray. Gray like the underside of a storm cloud. Gray like the color a lake goes at the exact moment the sun sets, and there is no more warmth in the world. And those eyes looked at her. For one full second, maybe two, maybe five, maybe her whole life. Then they moved to Josiah, and Josiah, poor Josiah, 28 years old, and full of hope and love for his brother and no wisdom about how the world actually works, said, "Eve, this is Miss Winifred Ashton. She has come from Ohio to be your wife." Ephraim Ambrose set the axe down. He looked at Winifred one more time. He said one word, "No." And he walked past the wagon, past the porch, past the barn, into the trees, into the mountain. He did not come back. Not that night, not the next morning, not the morning after that. The silence that followed his going was the loudest silence Winifred had ever heard. Gideon was the one who moved first. He climbed down from the wagon. He walked around to her side. He reached up his hand. "Miss Ashton." "Yes." "Please come inside." She let him help her down. Her legs did not shake. She would not allow her legs to shake. She had inherited from her father a body that obeyed her when it mattered. She walked up onto the porch. She walked through the door. She stopped, because the inside of the cabin was. It was not what she had expected, which was becoming a pattern she was already beginning to catalog. It was clean in the way a place is clean when someone has forgotten how to make it welcoming, but has not forgotten how to keep it functional. A long wooden table, 4 chairs, a stone fireplace big enough to walk into, a staircase that climbed to a loft, a door to the left that led to a bedroom she could see through the open frame, a door to the right that led to another, a back door that opened onto the yard, and a dog. An old dog, a gray-muzzled hound with rheumy eyes and one back leg that hung wrong. He was lying by the fire. He lifted his head when she entered. He looked at her. She looked at him. He lowered his head and thumped his tail against the floor. Once. Twice. Something in Winifred's chest cracked open. Because that dog was the first living thing in this house that had said hello to her without conditions. She crossed the room. She knelt down in her travel dress on the wooden floor. She put her hand on the dog's head. "Hello," she said. The dog closed his eyes. Behind her, Gideon said, "That's Job." Job. After the man in the Bible. "I know who Job is, Mr. Ambrose." "Yes, ma'am." She looked up. Gideon was standing in the doorway with her trunk on his shoulder. He was watching her hand on the old dog's head. His face had done something. She could not name what it had done, but something. "His leg," she said. "Been that way 2 years. He got kicked by a mule. Ephraim said it best he could, but it didn't take right." "I could look at it." Gideon's dark eyes moved to hers. "You a doctor, Miss Ashton?" "No, Mr. Ambrose. My father was." He held her gaze a moment longer than a stranger should have. Then he set her trunk down against the wall. "The bedroom on the left is yours," he said. "It was our mother's. Ephraim's is on the right. Josiah and I sleep in the loft." "Where does your brother sleep now?" "He doesn't. Not tonight." "Mr. Ambrose." "Ma'am." Where has he gone? Gideon looked toward the door that stood open onto the yard, toward the trees, toward the mountain that rose behind them. He'll be in the north cabin. It was our father's before he built this one. It's 5 miles up. He goes there when he needs to be alone. For how long? Gideon did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quiet, almost gentle. As long as it takes him to decide whether to come back. Winifred nodded once. She stood up. She smoothed her dress. She checked her locket. She lifted her chin. Well then, she said, we had better get supper started. He may come back hungry. Gideon Ambrose stared at her. For the second time in an hour, a man with the face of a mountain looked at a woman he had known for less than a day, like she was something he had not yet learned how to categorize. He said, yes, ma'am. And he went to fetch the potatoes. That night, Winifred slept in a bed that had belonged to a woman she had never met, in a room that smelled of cedar and old lavender, under a quilt stitched by hands that were now dead. She did not cry. She had promised herself in Ohio that she would not cry. She kept her promise. Because she had learned young that tears were a currency, and a woman on the frontier had better spend hers wisely. She lay on her back in the dark. She listened to the mountain. It made sounds she did not know, a wind that whistled through some crack she could not find, an owl, a creaking of the beams overhead as the cold settled deeper into the wood, a wolf far off, and then another closer answering. She thought about Ephraim Ambrose. She thought about the way his eyes had gone through her like a physician's needle, fast, clean, painless in the moment and painful only after. She thought about Josiah on his knees in the mud. She thought about Gideon carrying her trunk without being asked. She thought about the old dog job by the fire and the way he had thumped his tail. And she thought about the small, hard shape of the locket around her neck, the photograph inside it, the reason she had chosen this place of all the places she could have chosen. She had not lied to the agency. She had simply not told them everything. She closed her eyes. Somewhere out in the dark, 5 miles up the mountain, Ephraim Ambrose was also awake. She did not know that, but it was true. Morning came slowly in Silver Pine Ridge in late October. The sun did not so much rise as it seeped gray at first, then gold at the very tops of the highest pines, then finally into the yard. Winifred was up before either brother. She had built the fire because she had watched Gideon build it the night before, and she had a good memory for the way things were done. She had put water on for coffee. She had found the sack of oats and the tin of salt. She had put a pot of oatmeal on the crane over the coals. She had taken off her navy traveling dress. She had unpacked her second dress, a gray wool day dress, plainer, sturdier one her mother had made her before her mother died. She had pinned her hair up, simple and clean, because she was going to work. She was scrubbing the long wooden table when Josiah came down the ladder from the loft. He stopped on the fourth rung from the bottom. He looked at her. He looked at the fire, which was burning steady. He looked at the pot of oatmeal, which was beginning to smell right. He looked at the coffee, which was black and hot in its enameled pot. He looked at her again. Miss Ashton. Good morning, Mr. Ambrose. You made? Breakfast, yes. But what Mr. Ambrose, he came the rest of the way down the ladder, slowly, like a man approaching a wild animal that had inexplicably decided to bring him a rabbit. You do not have to do that, he said. She wrung out the rag over the wash bucket. I know I do not have to, Mr. Ambrose. I have chosen to. Ma'am. Yes. May I please call you Winifred? She looked at him. His silver eyes were tired. He had slept poorly. She could see it. The tightness around the mouth of a young man who had been chewing on his guilt all night. You may call me Winifred, she said. If I may call you Josiah. Yes. Then good morning, Josiah. Sit down. You look terrible. He almost laughed. The almost laugh caught in his throat and turned into something else halfway. He sat down at the long wooden table and put his head in his hands. I have made a mess of everything, he said into his palms. Yes. Winifred. Yes. I did not know what else to do. She set a cup of coffee in front of him. She sat down across from him. She wrapped her own hands around her own cup and let the warmth move up into her wrists. "Tell me," she said. He told her. He told her about his mother who had died when he was 6. Not Ephraim's mother, his own. Their father had married 3 times. Ephraim's mother had died in childbirth. Gideon's mother had died of consumption. Josiah's mother had died of a fever that came through the valley in the winter of 1856. He told her about their father Malachi Ambrose, who had raised 3 sons and 3 losses, and had held them together through nothing but stubbornness and love. He told her about how Malachi had died 4 years ago. A stroke. Fast. Merciful, they had all said. And how the 3 of them had stayed. Because this land was what their father had left them. Because they were brothers, even if they were only half-brothers, and their father had made it very clear from the time they were small that half was not a word that meant less. Half was a word that meant chosen. Then he told her about Rebecca. Winifred set down her coffee cup. "Rebecca," she said, "Ephraim's wife." "Yes." "She died." "Yes." "When?" "8 years ago this coming January." "Josiah." "Ma'am, how did she die?" He looked at the fire. He did not look at her. There was a storm in the January of 71. It came down out of the North Pass in the middle of the night, and it dropped 4 feet of snow in 6 hours, and it broke the roof of the little house they were living in then. Not this house, the old cabin. Rebecca. She was. He stopped. He took a breath. She was in the 8th month with their first child, a daughter we found out after. Sarah. Sarah lived 6 days. Rebecca did not last the storm. The fire popped. The old dog Job by the hearth sighed in his sleep. Winifred did not speak, because there was nothing to say, because her father had taught her that some griefs did not want to be answered. Some griefs only wanted to be witnessed. She reached across the table. She put her hand over Josiah's hand. He looked at her hand on his. He looked at her face. His eyes were wet. "He has not been the same," Josiah said. "Not for a day, not for an hour. He works, he eats, he sleeps sometimes, but he does not live, Winifred. He does not live. And I watched him last winter. I watched him get thinner, quieter. I watched him stop looking at the mountain when the sun set on it. And I thought. He could not finish. "You thought," Winifred said gently, "that if you could get a woman to come here, he might." I thought he might come back. Come back from where? Wherever he has gone." She closed her eyes. Because she knew that place. She knew exactly that place. Because after her father had died, she had gone there too. And it had taken her 8 months, in a great deal of anger, in one cold spring afternoon on the banks of the Missouri River, sitting alone with her feet in cold water, to find her way out. She opened her eyes. "Josiah." "Yes." "I am not angry with you." He looked at her. "You should be." "Yes, perhaps, but I am not. I am something else. I have not decided what yet. But it is not anger." The back door opened. Gideon came in. He had been out already. His coat was dusted with new snow. He carried a bucket of milk in one hand and an armful of split kindling in the other. He took one look at his brother's face. He took one look at Winifred's hand on his brother's hand. He took one look at the pot of oatmeal steaming on the fire and the coffee already made. He did not speak. He set the milk down. He set the kindling down. He walked to the fire. He crouched. He rubbed the old dog Job behind the ears. "She fed the dog too," Gideon said. Not to anyone in particular, almost to himself. "There was jerky in the pantry," Winifred said. "He looked at me. He looks at everyone. He looked at me differently." Gideon Ambrose, 32 years old, hard as the winter. He was raised in quiet as the mountain that raised him turned his head slowly and looked at Winifred Ashton across the room. He did not smile, but his eyes changed, just a little, just enough that a woman who had been trained to notice small changes might notice. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "He does that." The first day passed, then the second. Ephraim did not come down from the north cabin. Winifred did not ask when he would. She worked, because working was what her hands knew how to do, because a body in motion was a body that could not sit still and be afraid. She swept the cabin, all of it. She found dust that had lived in the corners for 2 seasons, and she convinced it to leave. She washed the windows with vinegar and rag until the light coming through them was different, brighter, the way light is different when it has been given permission to enter. She rebeat the rugs on the porch rail and hung them to air in the cold, clean sun. She looked at Job's back leg. She looked at it the way her father had taught her to look. Slow, thorough, without hurry. The break had healed wrong. Nothing to be done about that now. The bone had set at an angle that would never straighten. But the muscle around it had gone tight because he was favoring it, and the pad of that foot had a small crack in it from the way he set his weight when he walked. She warmed a compress of salt water and pine oil. She wrapped his foot. She held it in her lap for 20 minutes while he lay by the fire and watched her with his rheumy old eyes. "You are a good dog, Job," she said quietly. Job thumped his tail once. Gideon watched from the doorway. He did not say anything. He went back out to the barn. She cooked. Because they had venison hanging in the smokehouse, and because there was a barrel of last summer's carrots in the root cellar, and because she remembered from her mother's kitchen exactly how to turn those two things into something that could feed 3 men and 1 woman and make the whole cabin smell like it was a home. Josiah came in at dusk on the second day. He stopped just inside the door. He closed his eyes. "That smells," he said, "like my mother's kitchen on the night she died." Winifred turned from the fire ladle in her hand. "Josiah." "I know how that sounded. I mean, it smells good. It smells like a night when the house was warm and she was still." "I understand." He looked at her. His silver eyes were wet again. "You have been here 2 days, Winifred." "I know. And this cabin already." He gestured helplessly at everything. At the swept floor, at the clean windows, at the dog with the wrapped foot, at the pot on the fire, at her in her gray wool dress with a smudge of flour on her cheek she did not know was there. "This cabin already feels different," he said. She did not know what to answer. Because he was right. She could feel it too. Not because she was doing anything remarkable, but because the cabin had been holding its breath for 8 years, and now it had started to breathe again, just a little just around the edges. That evening after supper, after Josiah had gone up to the loft, Gideon sat by the fire and did not go to bed. Winifred sat across from him with her mending in her lap. She was stitching the tear in Josiah's second shirt. She had found the tear that morning. She had not been asked to mend it. The fire moved. The old dog slept. Outside, the wind came down off the pass and felt at the corners of the cabin like a stranger looking for a way in. Gideon spoke. "Miss Ashton." "Winifred, please, if we are going to live in the same house." "Winifred." "Yes." "May I ask you something?" "Yes." I was looking at the fire, not at her. In the 8 seconds it took him to phrase what he wanted to ask, she noticed that he did that. He looked at the fire when he was going to say something that mattered to him, because the fire could not be hurt by what he said. "Your father," he said. "Yes." "You said last night that he was a doctor." "Yes." "May I ask his name?" Winifred set her mending down in her lap, because it had come the moment sooner than she had planned for it to come. She had planned to give it more time. She had planned to know these men longer before she opened the locket at her throat and let the past come out. But Gideon Ambrose was looking at the fire, and he was asking gently, and she thought, that perhaps she had been wrong about how long these things took. His name, she said, was Dr. Obadiah Ashton. The fire popped. Gideon did not move. For a long moment he did not move at all. Then very slowly he turned his head and he looked at her, and his dark eyes had gone the color of a river bottom in early spring. Deep, layered, holding something under the surface that she could not yet see. "Obadiah Ashton," he said. "Yes." of Ohio. Now, yes, before Ohio, he practiced in Kansas. Before Kansas, he was in the territories. He traveled with wagon companies and army columns for 11 years before he settled down. Winifred. Yes. How old are you? 22. When were you born? In 56, in August. Gideon Ambrose stood up. He walked past her. I walked to the bedroom on the right side of the cabin, the one that had been Ephraim's. He opened the door. He knelt down. She could hear him from where she sat. She could hear him moving something. A trunk. A lid. He came back into the main room. He was carrying a small wooden box. Cedar. Carved with a design she recognized from her father's own box at home in Ohio. Not identical, but cousins. The same hand had made them both. He set the box on the table. He sat down across from her. He opened it. Inside were letters, a dozen letters, maybe more, yellowed with age, tied together with a piece of leather cord. He untied the cord. He unfolded the top letter. He turned it so she could read. She read. The handwriting was her father's. Her father's from before she had been born. From when he had been a young man, a very young man, riding with a survey party through the Bitterroot country in the summer of '52. The letter was addressed to Mal at Silverpine. It began, "My dear friend." Winifred's hand went to her mouth. Gideon watched her. "My father," Gideon said quietly, "spoke of a doctor once or twice a year, every year until he died. He spoke of a young doctor he had ridden with in '52. A doctor who had saved his leg after an arrow took him in the thigh outside of what is now Bozeman. My father said that doctor was the best man he had ever known, and that they had lost each other the way men lose each other, and that he had always hoped." Gideon stopped. He picked up the letter. He set it back down. He had always hoped, Gideon said, that they might meet again someday. They never did. Winifred could not speak. She reached up to her throat. She unclasped the locket. She opened it. She turned it so Gideon could see the small photograph inside. Two young men, both no more than 25, both standing shoulder to shoulder in front of a canvas surveyor's tent, both grinning at the camera like they knew a joke that God had not yet told the rest of the world. Gideon looked at the photograph. He looked at it for a very long time. "That is my father," he said. "Yes." "On the left?" "Yes." "And on the right?" "Is mine." The wind moved against the cabin. The fire moved on the hearth. The old dog Job breathed in and out at their feet. Gideon Ambrose put his hand flat on the table next to the letter, not touching it, just near it, like a man who had been offered something that was too large to hold all at once. "Winifred." "Yes." "How much of this did you know?" "All of it." "When you came?" "Yes." "Why did you not?" "Say." "Yes." She looked at him. She had rehearsed this. On the stagecoach. On the second night when she could not sleep in a boarding house in Kansas City. She had rehearsed how she would say it. She said none of the things she had rehearsed. She said, "Because I was afraid that if I told you first, you would think I had come here for the wrong reason. And I have not. I have come here because my father on the last night of his life, when the fever was high and he knew he was not going to see the morning, he held my hand, and he said to me, he said, 'Winifred, if ever you need a safe place, in this world, there is a family in the Bitterroot country, in a place called Silverpine Ridge. Their name is Ambrose. Find them. Tell them who your father was.'" She stopped, because her voice had begun to shake, and she had promised herself in Ohio that she would not. She took a breath. She went on. "I did not use the name. When I came, I saw the notice in the paper, in Kansas City, from the agency, and it said Silverpine Ridge. And I thought, perhaps, perhaps, perhaps my father had known, somehow, that this would be the way I found you." She lifted her chin. She looked Gideon Ambrose in the eye. "I did not come here to trick anyone," she said. "I did not come here to be a wife who was not wanted. I came here because I had no one else in the world, and my father had told me that here I might have someone. if I was brave enough to arrive. Gideon Ambrose looked at her across the table. She had been correct. On the platform, about his eyes, he did not waste them. He looked at her and his dark eyes did something that they had probably not done in a long time. They filled, not tears, not quite, but something close. He said, Winifred Ashton, yes, you are welcome here. Thank you. Whatever my brother decides. I know. He may not. I know that too. He nodded once. He folded the letter. He put it back in the box. He tied the cord. He set the box on the mantel where they could both see it, where it was not hidden anymore. Then he stood up. He said, Good night, Winifred. Good night, Gideon. He went up the ladder to the loft. She sat by the fire alone for a long time. She did not cry, but her hand kept going to the empty place at her throat where the locket had been, and finding it not there, and understanding slowly that she had set the past down. Not thrown it away, just set it down, where other people could see it. The photograph folded shut again lay on the table in front of her. Two young men, grinning, not knowing what was going to happen to them. She whispered to the room, Hello, Papa. The fire moved. Job thumped his tail once in his sleep. The morning of the third day came with fresh snow. 2 inches, just enough to cover the boot prints in the yard. Just enough to make the mountain look like it had been washed clean overnight. Winifred stood on the porch with a cup of coffee in her hands and watched the sun come up over the eastern ridge. She heard him before she saw him. A horse, coming down the mountain trail slowly, the sound of hooves moving through fresh snow, muffled, unhurried, tired. She did not turn her head. She stood very still. The horse came into the yard. The horse stopped at the corral. Boots hit the ground. Boots crossed the snow. Boots came up the porch steps. She still did not turn. Ephraim Ambrose stopped 3 feet behind her. He did not speak. She did not either. Because she had already decided in the sleepless middle of the second night that she was not going to speak first. She had already spoken first in her way. She had come here. She had stayed. She had swept his floor and cooked his supper and wrapped his dog's foot and shown his brother a locket that had lain against her heart for 4 years. She had done enough speaking. Now it was his turn. Ephraim Ambrose stood on his own porch on the third morning after his life had changed, without his permission, and he looked at the back of the head of the woman in the gray wool dress. He said nothing for a long time. Then very quietly, in a voice like a stone that had been underwater for a long time, he said, There is coffee. Yes, she said. I made it. May I have some? She turned. She turned slowly. She looked up at him. I was taller than she remembered. His eyes were more tired. There was pine sap on his sleeve and a cut on his hand that had not been properly cleaned, and shadows under his eyes that spoke of 3 nights without real sleep. She reached inside the doorway. She took down the second cup. She poured. She turned. She held it out to him with both hands. He took it with one. Their fingers touched. For a fraction of a second. For less than that. For the time it takes a heart to skip and then continue. He did not look away. She did not look away. She said without looking away, Your brother Gideon found the letters, Mr. Ambrose. Which letters? The ones your father kept. From my father. Ephraim's face did not change, but something behind his face did. She said, My father was Dr. Obadiah Ashton. Ashton. Yes. Of Ohio. Now, yes, once of the territories. He rode with your father in 52. Ephraim looked at her. Then he looked down at the coffee cup in his hand. Then he looked out at the mountain which was turning gold at the top edge as the sun cleared the ridge. He did not speak for a full minute. Winifred counted. 60 seconds. 61. 62. At 63, he said, My father told me about your father. When I was a boy, he said your father saved his life. Yes. He said your father was the best man he had ever known. That is what he said about your father, too. Ephraim closed his eyes, just for a moment. Then he opened them. Miss Ashton. Yes. I do not know what to do with you. I know that. I did not ask for a wife. I know that too. I. He stopped. He looked at her. I was 35 years old. He had lost a wife. He had lost a daughter. He had lost 8 years to a grief that had eaten him from the inside out. And he had known when he walked down out of the mountain this morning that he could not keep running from something that had come this far to find him. But he did not know how to say any of that. So he said instead the only thing he could say. He said, I will stay in the north cabin. She nodded. Josiah's room is yours. I will not. He stopped. I will not intrude. Mr. Ambrose. Yes. You will not stay in the north cabin. It is October. There is a stove there, I imagine, but there is no proper roof for winter, or Gideon would not have said what he said about you deciding to come back. He almost, the corner of his mouth almost moved. You have been talking to my brother. I have. He said too much. He said exactly enough. She turned. She walked to the door. She stopped. She looked back over her shoulder at him. You will sleep in your own bedroom tonight, Mr. Ambrose. I will sleep in your mother's. Josiah and Gideon will remain in the loft. We will not decide anything else until we have decided that. Now come inside. Breakfast is on the fire. She went inside. Ephraim Ambrose stood on the porch alone for a long time. He looked at the coffee in his hand. He looked at the door she had gone through. I looked at the mountain. He said quietly to no one, God help me. And he went inside. That night after supper, after the dishes were washed, and Job was snoring by the fire, and Josiah had gone up to the loft, and Gideon had gone out to check the horses one last time, Winifred stood at the door of her mother-in-law's bedroom with her hand on the latch. Ephraim was seated at the table. He had a book open in front of him. He was not reading it. She could tell. He had not turned a page in 20 minutes. She said from the doorway, Good night, Mr. Ambrose. He lifted his head. His gray eyes met hers across the room. For one long second, he did not answer. Then he said, Good night, Miss Ashton. She stepped into the bedroom. She closed the door. She stood with her back against it in the dark, and she pressed one hand flat over her heart, because her heart was beating in a rhythm she did not recognize, because the wall she had built around it in St. Louis and reinforced in Ohio and packed carefully into her trunk for the 11-day stage ride from Kansas City to Copper Hollow had developed very quietly in 3 days a crack straight down the middle. She did not know what to do about that. She did not know yet, but she knew that she was going to find out. Outside her window, the mountain rose black against the stars. Inside the cabin, a man who had not slept in his own bed for 8 winters put out the lamp. And in the loft above them, Gideon Ambrose lay on his back in the dark, listening to the sounds of his brother's house, becoming a home again, and he thought for the first time in a very long time that his father would have been pleased. Winter came down out of the North Pass on the 4th morning. Not slowly, not politely, the way winter comes to Ohio where it announces itself with a week of gray sky and a slow drift of leaves. Montana winter did not do that. Montana winter arrived the way a hand slaps a table. Sudden, loud, impossible to ignore. Winifred woke in the dark before dawn to the sound of wind against the cabin. Not wind. Wind was too soft a word. This was something else. This was the mountain breathing hard through its teeth. She sat up. She wrapped the quilt around her shoulders. She went to the small window of her bedroom and rubbed a circle in the frost with the heel of her hand. The world outside was white. Not gray. White. 6 inches of new snow had fallen in the night, and it was still falling. And beyond the porch rail, the horses in the corral were dark ghosts moving slow through a whirl of it. Winifred stood at the window for a long moment. She had never seen weather like this. She had never even imagined weather like this. And she thought, very quietly, very calmly, she thought, well, so this is where I live now. She dressed, 2 layers of wool, her heaviest stockings, her boots, the gray dress over everything. She pinned her hair up quickly. She opened her bedroom door. The main room of the cabin was already awake. Ephraim Ambrose stood at the fireplace feeding the fire with pieces of split pine he had brought up from the porch stack. He was in his shirt sleeves. The sleeves were rolled to the elbows. His forearms were the color of oak that had lived outside a long time. He did not turn around when she came out, but he said without turning, "Coffee is on." "Thank you." "Bad storm." "I can see that." "Josiah is out with the horses. Gideon is checking the smokehouse roof." "What can I do?" Ephraim Ambrose stopped feeding the fire. He turned his head. His gray eyes met hers across the length of the room. For 4 days he had been avoiding those eyes. He had eaten his meals with his head down. He had spoken only when he needed to. He had gone to bed early and risen before anyone else. He had done everything a man could do to share a cabin with a woman he had not chosen and still keep some kind of wall between them. But this morning, with the storm at the window and the fire snapping, he looked at her. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "There is a leak in the north corner of the roof, where the ridge beam meets the stone." "Yes." "When the wind blows from the pass, snow comes in through it, melts, drips onto the floor, rots the boards over time." "Yes, I have been meaning." "I know." "4." "Yes, 2 years." He almost smiled. Almost. It was the kind of almost smile that a man produces when he is confessing something he is not proud of, and the woman he is confessing to has already forgiven him before he finished. "Bring me an oilcloth," he said, "and that tin bucket in the pantry, and a rag." "Yes." She brought them. He climbed a ladder that went up to the loft, and from the loft to a small trap that opened into the crawl space under the roof. He was up there for 20 minutes. She could hear him moving. She could hear the sound of a hammer. She could hear him swearing once quietly under his breath. When he came down, there was pine sap in his hair and cobwebs on his shoulder and a smear of soot across his cheek. She reached up before she thought. She brushed the cobweb off his shoulder with the flat of her hand. He went very, very still. Her hand paused. She was not touching him. She was touching the wool of his shirt. But she could feel through the wool the shape of his shoulder, the heat of him, the way his body had gone still like a deer that had heard a twig break. She stepped back. "Sorry," she said quickly. "There was a... I did not think." "It is all right. It was only..." "I know." "A cobweb." "Yes." I was still looking at her. She turned away too fast. She went to the fire. She busied her hands with the coffee pot she did not need to busy them with. Behind her, she heard him let out a slow breath. She did not turn around. She was not going to turn around. She said into the fire, "There is oatmeal when your brothers come in." "Thank you." He went out to help Gideon with the smokehouse. Winifred stood at the fire with her hand pressed flat against her stomach, which was doing something strange, which had been doing something strange since the morning she had brushed the cobweb off his shoulder, which was not the sort of thing she was going to name yet. Not yet. Not until she had more evidence. The storm blew for 2 days. For 2 days, the four of them lived inside the cabin together in a way that Winifred understood after the first night was a small miracle. Because a cabin that had held only silent grieving men for 8 years now held 4 people. 4 sets of feet on the floor. 4 voices at the table, even if one of those voices spoke only rarely. 4 sets of hands doing the work of keeping a house alive in a storm. She learned things about them. She learned that Josiah could not sit still, that he whittled small animals out of pine while he sat by the fire, that he had a whole collection of them on a shelf above his loft bed. A bear, a fox, 2 horses, a rabbit with one ear missing because his knife had slipped. She learned that Gideon read, actually read. He had a stack of books on the small table by his side of the loft. Plutarch, a worn Bible that had belonged to their mother, a copy of Twelfth Night of All Things that he brought down on the second night and quoted from over supper without warning. "If music be the food of love," he said, ladling stew into his brother's bowl, "play on. Give me excess of it, that surfeiting the appetite may sicken and so die. Everyone stared at him. He looked up. What? Nothing, Josiah said. Only, since when do you memorize Shakespeare? Since before you were born. You never once, you never once asked. Winifred laughed. She did not mean to. It came out of her before she knew it was coming. Both brothers turned to look at her. Ephraim at the head of the table lifted his eyes from his bowl. She put her hand over her mouth. I am sorry, she said. Do not be sorry, Josiah said. It is the first time you have laughed since you got here. She lowered her hand. She looked down at her stew. That is not true, she said quietly. It is. I laughed on Tuesday when Job stole a piece of bacon off your plate. That was a smile. It was a laugh. Winifred, Josiah, it was not a laugh. Ephraim Ambrose said without lifting his head from his bowl. Leave her alone, Josiah. Josiah closed his mouth. Gideon looked at Ephraim over the top of his book. Winifred looked at her stew, because Ephraim Ambrose had just said her name. Not directly, not to her, but her. He had said her. He had defended her in his own quiet way, at his own table in his own house. And the crack in the wall around her heart went a little deeper. The storm lifted on the morning of the 5th day. The world outside was the country she did not recognize. Every branch of every pine was bent under its load. The corral fence stood almost buried on the north side. The path to the barn had to be shoveled, and Josiah did it whistling because Josiah did not know how to work in silence. Gideon rode out to check the herd. Ephraim went with him. Winifred was alone in the cabin. Well, not quite alone. Old Job lay by the fire. She sat down beside him on the wooden floor. She put her hand on his gray head. Job. He thumped his tail. I need to tell someone. He thumped his tail again. And you are the only one in this cabin who does not talk back. He sighed, a deep, ancient dog sigh. The sigh of a creature that had heard all the important confessions of a lifetime and had never once betrayed a single one. Winifred looked at the fire. She said very quietly, I think I may have made a terrible mistake. Job did not answer. Because I did not come here to fall in love with a man, she said. I came here for a place, that is all. A safe place. My father's promise. And now. She stopped. She pressed her forehead against the top of the dog's head. And now she whispered, I look at him, and I forget what I came here for. And when he brushes past me in the kitchen, I forget my own name. And when he says my name, which he does not say, because he barely speaks, but when he does, Job, when he does, I. She stopped. She sat up. She wiped the corner of her eye with the back of her wrist. This is not what I planned, she said to the dog. This is not what I planned at all. Job looked at her. Job, with his one crooked leg and his rheumy eyes and his gray old face, looked at her with the wisdom of dogs that have been on this earth a long time and know a great many things they cannot say. He thumped his tail twice, which was a lot from Job. She almost laughed. Then she heard the horses coming into the yard. She stood up, fast. She smoothed her dress. She wiped her cheek with the heel of her hand. She checked her hair. She turned to the fire so that her back was to the door, so that when the door opened, she could pretend she had been busy with the fire, so that no one would see that her face had done any of the things it had just done. The door opened. Only Gideon came in. He came in fast. His face was set. His mouth was a line. Winifred. She turned. Yes, there is a man riding up the trail, not one of ours. Who? I do not know, but he is dressed for town, not for country, and there is a company mark on his saddlebag. She looked at him. She said, what kind of mark? I could not read the full name, but it starts with a D. Winifred Ashton's hand went to her stomach, because she had suspected. For 4 days she had suspected. For 4 days she had watched the way Ephraim Ambrose lifted his head every time a horse whinnied in the yard, the way Gideon had checked the north fence twice a day, without being asked the way Josiah had stopped whistling when the topic of the neighbor's cattle came up. She had known something was coming. She had not known it would come this soon. She said, "Where is Ephraim?" "Coming behind me, 2 minutes." "Good. Meet the rider in the yard. Do not invite him in. Do not answer any questions. Say only that your brother is on his way." Winifred. "Yes." "Who do you think it is?" She looked at the door. Then she looked at Gideon. "I think it is a man who is about to make a mistake," she said. "Let us give him room to make it." The man in the yard was in his 40s. He wore a gray wool coat that was better than any coat that had ever been seen in Copper Hollow. His boots were clean. His hat was clean. His gloves were clean. In a country where nothing stayed clean past 9 in the morning, everything about him was clean, and that alone told Winifred more than any letter of introduction could have told her. He sat on his horse in the yard. He did not dismount. He smiled down at Gideon. "Mr. Ambrose," he said. "Yes. My name is Cornelius Rook. I am here on behalf of Drayton Silver Consortium of Denver, Colorado." "All right. Mr. Percival Drayton, the president of our consortium, has authorized me to make a very generous offer for the mineral rights of your homestead, specifically the northeast quarter section which our surveys indicate." He stopped, because Ephraim Ambrose had ridden into the yard behind him. Ephraim did not dismount either. He sat on his big bay gelding and looked at Cornelius Rook the way a mountain looks at a piece of weather that has drifted up against it. He said one word: "No." Cornelius Rook turned in his saddle. He smiled. The smile did not reach his eyes. "Mr. Ambrose, Ephraim, if I may, perhaps we could discuss." "No. We are prepared to offer a sum that." "No. Sir, if you would only." "No." Cornelius Rook stopped talking. His smile stayed on his face, but his eyes did the thing that Winifred had learned to watch for in men like him. His eyes flattened. They stopped being eyes and became small pieces of glass. He said quietly, "Mr. Drayton is not a patient man. He does not need to be. He has all the time in the world to leave my land." "Ephraim." "Off my porch, Mr. Rook." Cornelius Rook nodded slowly. He tipped his hat to Gideon. He tipped his hat toward the cabin where Winifred stood at the doorway. He looked at Winifred for one full second. His eyes went over her the way a merchant's eyes go over a bolt of cloth, assessing, calculating. Then he wheeled his horse and rode out. Winifred stood in the doorway with her hand on the frame. She said very quietly, so that only Gideon, who was closest, could hear, "He will be back." Gideon said, "I know. He will not come himself the next time." "I know." She stepped out onto the porch. She walked down the steps in her gray dress. She walked out to Ephraim, still on his horse, and she put her hand on the bay's nose. The bay lowered his head to her. She looked up at Ephraim. She said, "Mr. Ambrose." "Yes, we should talk, tonight, all four of us." "About what?" "About Percival Drayton, about what he has been doing to your neighbors, about what he has done before, because I have seen this before, Mr. Ambrose, and I know how it ends, and I would like very much to help you make sure it does not end that way here." Ephraim Ambrose looked down at her. His gray eyes had gone very hard, not at her, at the space where Cornelius Rook had just been. Then his eyes softened, just around the edges, just when they came back to her. He said, "All right, Miss Ashton." "Winifred." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but almost. "Winifred," he said. The wall around her heart cracked again, and she thought from very far away, from somewhere behind her own eyes. Oh no. That evening at the long wooden table with the fire high and the wind low and old Job, asleep on the hearth, Winifred Ashton laid out what she knew. She had brought her notebook down from the bedroom. She had brought a small leather folder that had traveled with her from Ohio inside her medical bag, wrapped in oilskin, wrapped again in her second-best petticoat so that no eye but hers had seen it in 3 years. She opened the folder in the middle of the table. Josiah leaned forward. Gideon leaned forward. Ephraim, at the head of the table, did not lean forward, But he did not lean back either. Winifred said, "In St. Louis 3 years ago, I was engaged to be married." The three men looked at her. She kept her voice steady. His name was Edwin Cross. He was a young attorney. He specialized in property law, specifically in disputed boundaries, mineral rights, and water access on behalf of large commercial interests. Railroads, mining companies, timber outfits. She turned the folder. These are copies of 6 filings he made in 1874 and 75 against 4 farming families in Jefferson County, Missouri. 2 of the families sold under duress. 1 went bankrupt fighting the case. 1 won on appeal to a federal circuit when a judge ruled the survey methodology fraudulent. Ephraim had picked up the top page. He was reading it. His face did not change. Winifred said, "I did not know what Edwin was doing until 3 months before we were to be married. I had been helping him in his office, filing, copying documents. He thought I did not read what I copied. I read every word. When I understood what I was reading, I went to a competing firm with the evidence. I broke off the engagement the next morning." Josiah said softly, "Winifred." She did not look at him, because if she looked at him, she would not finish. "Edwin's family filed a defamation complaint against me. It was dismissed in 2 weeks because my evidence was too strong. But the filing exists. It is public record. A man like Percival Drayton with the right connections could find it." She looked up. She met Ephraim's eyes across the table. "You should know that," she said, "before we go any further." Ephraim Ambrose set down the paper he was reading. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Miss Ashton." "Winifred, Winifred, Winifred." "Yes. Why are you telling us this?" She took a breath. "Because Cornelius Rook is going to try to use it. He is going to ride back into Copper Hollow tonight or tomorrow, and he is going to start telling anyone who will listen that the woman who has come to Silver Pine Ridge is a con artist from Missouri who once tried to destroy an honest lawyer's career. That is the playbook. I have seen it. I know how they work." Ephraim did not move. Gideon said quietly, "So we get ahead of it." "Yes." "How?" "We ride into town tomorrow. We speak to your sheriff. What is his name?" "Everett Boone." "Is he a good man?" Ephraim and Gideon looked at each other. Josiah answered, "He was. Was. There was talk last spring that someone in Denver had paid a call at his office. He denied it, but he has been careful since then." Winifred nodded. She said, "Then we do not go to him yet. Not tomorrow. Tomorrow we do something else. Tomorrow we ride out to the family who was hurt the worst before now. Because Rook did not just start with you, Mr. Ambrose. Men like Drayton never start with the strongest ranch. They start at the edges. They start with the widow. They start with the old man. They start with the family that will fold first and set the pattern." Josiah's face changed. He said, "The Whitakers." "Who?" "Old Barnaby Whitaker. Lives alone on the far side of the creek. Wife died 4 years ago. Son moved to Denver for work. Barnaby has been." He stopped. He looked at his brothers. "Barnaby has been strange," he said. "For months. He used to come by every Sunday. He has not been by since August." Winifred nodded. She wrote something in her notebook. She looked up. She said, "Then tomorrow morning I will pay a call on Mr. Whitaker." Ephraim said, "You will not go alone." "I was not planning to." "I will go with you." She looked at him. He looked at her. The fire moved on the hearth. Old Job thumped his tail once in his sleep. Gideon, watching them both, kept his face very carefully still. "All right," Winifred said. "We will go together." Barnaby Whitaker lived in a small log house on a creek that ran silver even in the middle of winter. The house had a sag in its porch. The chimney needed pointing. There was a wagon in the yard with a broken axle that had been broken since spring, and nobody had fixed it, and that alone told Winifred something. She and Ephraim rode up slow. She was on a small brown mare that Gideon had chosen for her. Gideon had said the mare would not spook. He had said the mare had a mouth like silk. He had said this quietly in the barn at dawn, while he adjusted the stirrups to her height without needing to ask. Ephraim rode beside her on his big bay. They did not speak on the ride. They had not spoken much at breakfast either. But something had shifted. Something small. Because at breakfast, when she had passed him the bread, his hand had touched hers, and this time neither of them had pulled back too fast. Barnaby Whitaker came out onto his sagging porch with a rifle. He was 70 years old. His beard was white. His eyes were tired. He saw Ephraim. He lowered the rifle. He said, "Ephraim Ambrose." "Barnaby, you brought a woman." "Yes." "To my house." "Yes." "You have never brought a woman to my house." "No." Barnaby Whitaker looked at Winifred. He looked at her for a long moment. And Winifred, who had spent 10 years of her life sitting quietly in her father's examining room, while frightened patients tried to decide if they trusted the young doctor with the honest face, saw in Barnaby Whitaker's tired eyes the exact same look she had seen 100 times before. The look of a man who was carrying a secret that was too heavy for him. The look of a man who wanted to set it down but did not know how. She dismounted. She walked up onto the porch, slowly. She did not look at him. She looked at the porch itself. She said, "Your rail is loose, Mr. Whitaker." Barnaby blinked. "What?" "Your porch rail, on the west end. It has come loose from the post. When the spring thaw comes and the ground softens, that whole corner is going to sink." "Ma'am, I am Winifred Ashton, Mr. Whitaker. My father was Dr. Obadiah Ashton. Malachi Ambrose and my father were friends once a long time ago. I would like to come inside and speak with you, if I may." Barnaby Whitaker looked at her. Then he looked at Ephraim. Ephraim gave a small nod. Barnaby lowered the rifle the rest of the way. He turned. He walked into his own house without another word. Winifred followed him. Ephraim on his horse in the yard did not dismount for a full minute because his hand was shaking, which was something his hand had not done since a January night in 1871. He looked down at his own hand. He said quietly to himself, "Well." Then he dismounted and tied both horses and followed the woman he had begun to think of as his own into the house of the old man he had known since he was a boy. Inside Barnaby Whitaker's house, Winifred sat down at a small table by a small fire, and she did not speak for a full minute. She let the old man look at her. She let the old man breathe. She let the old man watch her hands, which were folded quietly on the table, and she let him see that her hands were not going anywhere. Then she said softly, "Mr. Whitaker." "Yes." "How long has it been?" "How long has what been?" "How long has it been since you slept a full night?" His eyes filled. She had seen it before. The moment a man who has been holding a secret for a long time realizes that the person in front of him already knows. Barnaby Whitaker did not cry, but his eyes filled and his old veined hand went up to his beard and he pulled at it once hard. "Ma'am," he said. "Yes." "I have done a bad thing." "Yes." "You know that." "I suspect it. I do not know the shape of it." "Ephraim." The old man's eyes went past her to Ephraim, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hand. "Ephraim, I." "Barnaby." "I have been." "Sit down, Barnaby." Barnaby Whitaker sat down. Winifred poured him a cup of the coffee that was already on his stove. Bad coffee. Old coffee. Coffee that had been sitting in a pot since the day before. She poured it anyway. She put it in front of him. She said, "Tell us." He told them. His son Elias had gone to Denver 2 years ago looking for work. Elias had been a good boy, a steady boy, but he had gotten mixed up with the wrong company. A gambling debt. Then a bigger debt. Then a man who came to Elias one night and said, "My employer will settle this debt for you, and in exchange we would like something small from your father. Nothing much, only information, only where your father's neighbors ride, and when, and which fences are strongest, and which are weakest." "They said it was small," Barnaby whispered. They said no one would be hurt." Winifred did not move. "Was your neighbor's fence cut?" In September, Barnaby closed his eyes. Yes, by men you told them how to reach. Yes. Whose cattle did they take? He could not speak. Ephraim's voice from the doorway was very quiet. Old man. Barnaby looked up. Was it mine? Barnaby Whitaker began to cry. Not the crying of a man. The crying of an old man who has been holding it in for months. Silent. Terror. Shoulders shaking. Face buried in his hands. They said, he sobbed, they said Elias would come home. Winifred stood up. She walked around the table. She knelt in front of the old man on the wooden floor of his own kitchen. She put her hand on his knee. She said, Mr. Whitaker. Ma'am, look at me. He looked at her. How much do they still hold over you? They say Elias will not be released until I. Until you what? Until they have your husband's north pasture. She heard behind her the door. She heard Ephraim step forward. She held up her hand without looking at him. He stopped. She said gently to Barnaby, Mr. Whitaker, what if I told you that we could get your son back, without giving them 1 acre, not one? He stared at her. How? By making them wish they had never come to this valley in the first place. By making the people who own Elias in Denver very, very afraid of the woman in this kitchen and the 3 men who stand behind her. Barnaby Whitaker looked at her. He looked at her the way a drowning man looks at a rope. You are only a woman, he said, not cruelly, only in wonder, only because he was 70 years old and he had lived his whole life in a country where women did not do the thing Winifred Ashton was doing in his kitchen. She smiled, only a small smile, only the corner of her mouth. She said, yes, Mr. Whitaker, I am, and that is exactly why they will not see me coming. They rode home in the dusk. The sky was pink at the western edge. The mountain was already black. The snow crunched under the horses. They did not speak for the first mile. Then Winifred said, you should not have come inside so quickly. You told me to come in. I told you to come in eventually, not right away. He needed to see me. He needed to see me first. Winifred, yes, you did that thing. What thing? You made a man tell you something he had not told anyone in 6 months, without threatening him. I asked him a question. You asked him about his sleep. Yes. How did you know? She looked at Ephraim in the last light. She said, because my father used to say, a body will tell you what a mouth will not. And I had already looked at his porch, and his wagon, and his beard which he had stopped trimming, and I knew. Ephraim rode in silence for a moment. Then he said, Winifred, yes, your father must have been a great man. He was. I wish I had met him. She looked at the mountain ahead of them. The mountain his father had walked as a young surveyor. The mountain her father had ridden through in 1852 with an arrow in his thigh and Malachi Ambrose beside him. She said, you did meet him, Mr. Ambrose, in every letter that lies in the box on your mantle. Ephraim did not answer, but his gloved hand resting on his thigh closed once into a fist and then opened again. That night after supper, after Josiah and Gideon had heard the whole of the Whitaker story and had sat in stunned silence for the length of a whole cup of coffee, Ephraim Ambrose went out onto the porch alone. Winifred watched him go. She waited 5 minutes. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. She went out too. I was standing at the end of the porch, looking at the black shape of the mountain against the stars. She stopped beside him. He did not turn. He said without turning, Rebecca. Her breath caught, because it was the first time he had said the name out loud. In her hearing, in any of the days she had been under this roof. She did not speak. She waited. Rebecca was afraid of storms, Ephraim said. Yes. She would come and sit with me on the porch when they came in. Not to watch them, she hated them, but because if she sat with me, she was less afraid. Yes, I did not sit with her the night she died. Winifred's hand went to her mouth. He kept talking, very quietly, almost to the mountain, not to her. I was in the barn, foaling a mare. It went bad. I lost the foal. I did not come back to the house until 3 in the morning. And when I came back, the roof of the old cabin had gone in on the north corner. And Rebecca was. He stopped. Winifred said, "You do not have to." Sarah lived 6 days, Ephraim said. Rebecca lived until the sun came up. I sat with her until she went. And after she went, I did not know what to do. I could not remember how a man knew what to do. She did not touch him. She wanted to. She wanted to reach up and put her hand on his sleeve, on his shoulder, on the side of his face. She did not, because he was not asking to be touched. He was asking to be heard. She stood beside him in the cold and the dark, and she was heard for him. She was heard for both of them, for the woman who had been afraid of storms, and the little girl who had lived 6 days, and she stood as still as she had ever stood in her life. Ephraim said finally, "I thought if I let no one in again, I would not have to sit through another one of those nights. Yes, I have not been living, Winifred. I know. I have been. I know." He turned his head. He looked at her in the dark. She could barely see his face, only the shape of it, only the shine of his eyes. He said, "The night you came, I walked up to the north cabin. I sat in the dark. I asked my father what I was supposed to do. Yes." He did not answer me. "No." "But this morning?" "Yes." "When you walked into old Barnaby's house?" "Yes." "I heard him." She did not speak. She could not. Ephraim Ambrose, 35 years old, widower, mountain man, half-brother of two, the man who had said one word on his porch 3 days ago and walked into the trees for 3 days afterward, looked at her in the dark and said quietly, "He said her name is Ashton, and she has come home." Winifred Ashton closed her eyes. She let 2 tears go, only 2. She had budgeted them. She said yes. Ephraim did not touch her. Not that night. But he reached out, and he took very lightly, only for a moment, the corner of her shawl in his gloved hand. He held the corner of her shawl. He did not pull. He did not tug her toward him. He only held the wool of it the same way she had brushed the cobweb from his shoulder 4 days ago. Then he let go. He said, "Good night, Winifred. Good night, Ephraim." I went inside. She stood on the porch alone for a long time. She was not cold. She should have been cold. She was not. The days that followed moved fast, because they had a plan now, and a plan is a thing that moves. Winifred wrote letters. She wrote to a lawyer she had heard of in Colorado Springs, a man named Nathaniel Ferrers, who had argued the Jefferson County case successfully 3 years ago on behalf of the family that had won. She had never met him. She wrote to him anyway. She wrote him a letter that Gideon rode into Copper Hollow to post, and she paid the extra fee for the fastest stage, and she came home and worked in the kitchen with her hands shaking. Josiah rode to the Beaumont place, and to the Aldrich place, and to the Meridew place. He listened. He came back with 3 more stories that fit inside Winifred's growing folder, like puzzle pieces that had always been meant to fit. Gideon opened the cedar box on the mantel. He read every one of his father's letters again. And on the 8th night, he came down from the loft with a piece of paper he had not showed anyone. He laid it on the table in front of Winifred and Ephraim. I said, "There is something in one of the letters from 1857. My father mentions a name." Winifred looked down. She read. She stopped breathing for 1 full second. She said, "Percival Drayton." Gideon said yes. "Your father knew him." 20 years ago, my father worked as a surveyor for a mining company out of Butte for 1 season. He mentions in this letter that his supervisor, quote, "asked me to sign a map that was not true, and I would not, and now I am home, and I will not go back." Winifred and Ephraim looked at each other across the table. Ephraim's face had gone very still. Winifred said softly, "The supervisor." Gideon said, "Percival Drayton." The fire popped. Old Job on the hearth lifted his head, then lowered it. Winifred stood up. She walked to the window. She looked out at the mountain, which was silver under a 3/4 moon. She said without turning, "So this is not a business deal to him." Ephraim said, "No. This is old." "Yes. He does not want your land, Ephraim. He wants my father, 20 years dead, to be finally wrong." She turned. She looked at all three of the brothers. Josiah at the end of the table was crying quietly. He did not know he was. Gideon in the middle had one hand pressed flat against the letter, as if to hold it down against a wind. Ephraim at the head was looking at her, only at her. She said, "Then we are not fighting a mining company. No, we are finishing something. Yes, something your father started." Ephraim Ambrose stood up. He walked around the table. He stopped in front of her. I was very tall in the firelight, and very tired, and very sure. He said, "Yes, Winifred," and for the first time in 8 years, and for the first time in her life, he lifted his hand and touched with only the tip of one calloused finger the fine bone of her cheek. Just once, just barely. The wall around her heart did not crack this time. The wall around her heart came down. She whispered, "Ephraim." He whispered, "I know." He stepped back. He nodded at his brothers. He said, "We finish it, all four of us." And outside in the dark, 5 miles down the trail, a man Percival Drayton had never met, but had employed by the month for 6 months, rode his horse very carefully up the last ridge before the Ambrose homestead came into view. He had a black canvas hood in his saddlebag. He had a length of clean rope. He had a note in his pocket that he had written himself and that Percival Drayton had never seen, and that changed everything. His name was Elias Barrow. He was coming for Winifred, but not for the reason anyone thought. The wind came up out of the pass. The snow began again very softly. And inside the cabin, Winifred Ashton, whose heart had opened for the first time in her adult life, laughed at something Josiah said, and none of them heard the horse. Not yet. She went out to fetch a bucket of milk from the spring house at first light. That was all, a bucket of milk, because the milk had frozen in the churn overnight and she wanted it fresh for breakfast. And she had told Gideon she would fetch it herself so that he could finish shoeing the bay. She wore her heavy shawl. She wore her boots. She walked the 60 yards to the spring house, the way she had walked it every morning since she came to this place. And the ground was hard and the sun was pink at the top of the eastern ridge, and she was thinking as she walked about the letter she wanted to write to Nathaniel Ferrers that afternoon. She was thinking about how she would phrase the paragraph about Percival Drayton's connection to Malachi Ambrose in 1857. She was thinking about whether Ephraim would let her hold his hand when they sat by the fire that night, or whether he would need 3 more days, or 5, or a week. She was thinking about how she was becoming a woman who counted days by how many of them had gone by since the last time he had almost touched her, and how she was not entirely sure she was proud of that. She reached the spring house. She opened the door. She did not see the man behind her. She did not hear him, because the ground was frozen hard as a tabletop, and because he had already been standing in the shadow of the woodpile for 20 minutes waiting, and because he was very good at what he did. She only felt an arm around her waist, a gloved hand over her mouth. She had one breath, one, to think anything. She thought, not like this. And then the world went dark because the black canvas hood came down over her head, and she was lifted off her feet, and she was carried. The horse was already saddled 20 yards behind the spring house in the trees where the trail bent north. She was on it before she understood what had happened. A rope around her wrists, tight but not cutting, a hand at her back holding her upright, then a voice, low, at her ear, right against the canvas hood. The voice said, "Miss Ashton, do not scream. I am not going to hurt you. I am going to save your life. Do you understand me? Nod if you understand me." She did not nod. She was not going to nod for this man. The voice was silent for a moment. Then it said, "Fair enough." The horse moved. She rode with a hood over her head for what she guessed to be an hour and a half. Long enough for the sun to climb high enough that she could feel a little warmth through the canvas. Long enough for her to catalog everything she could about the man behind her. He held her steady but not close. He did not smell of whiskey. He did not smell of the cheap tobacco the men in Copper Hollow smoked. He smelled of pine smoke and horse sweat, and underneath both faintly of a good soap she did not recognize. His horse was not a common horse. Not by the pace, not by the way it moved under him. He did not speak for the whole ride. When he lifted her down, she stumbled. He caught her elbow. He said, "Steady, ma'am." He led her inside somewhere. She could tell by the change in air. Colder first, then 10 steps later, warmer. A cabin, a small one. A fire low but going. The smell of pine sap in the walls. He lifted the hood off. Winifred Ashton blinked in the sudden light. She looked around. She was in a one-room trapper's cabin. Rough-cut walls, a tin stove, a narrow bunk, a window with the shutter half closed, a table with a leather satchel on it, a rifle on 2 pegs above the door, but the rifle was not loaded. She could tell because the action was open. The man who had taken her was standing in front of her. He had pulled the scarf down from his face. I was younger than she had thought. Late 20s, sandy hair going darker at the roots, a crooked nose that had been broken once long ago and set by someone who did not know how to set noses. Eyes the color of pale creek water. He said, "Miss Ashton, I would like to untie your wrists. If I do, will you sit down and speak to me for 1 hour?" She said, "Who are you?" "My name is Elias Barrow." "You work for Percival Drayton." "I did, I do not now, as of 6 days ago, which is why I have taken you." She looked at him. She said, "You are going to have to explain that." "I will. May I untie your wrists?" She held out her hands. He untied the rope. His fingers were quick and careful. He did not touch her more than he had to. He stepped back the moment she was free. She rubbed her wrists. She looked at the door. He did not move to block it. He said, "The door is not locked, ma'am. You can walk out at any time. It is 9 miles to your husband's cabin. It is snowing hard now, harder than it was when we came in. You would not make it before dark. I am asking you to sit for 1 hour. If you still wish to leave after that, I will saddle a horse and ride you back myself. On my life." She sat down, not because she trusted him, because her legs were shaking. Because it had just occurred to her in the last 30 seconds that Ephraim Ambrose was going to come looking for her, and that Ephraim Ambrose was going to ride out of that cabin with his father's long rifle across his saddle, and that he was going to ride into whatever was waiting for him at the end of her hoof prints in the snow. She said, "Talk fast, Mr. Barrow." Elias Barrow sat down across from her. He put a leather-bound notebook on the table between them. He opened it. He said, "Do you know a woman named Rebecca Ambrose?" Her breath stopped. "That is not. Please, that is not fair, Mr. Barrow." "I am not being fair, ma'am. I am being fast. You asked me to be fast." "What do you know about Rebecca?" Elias Barrow looked at her across the table. He said quietly, "Rebecca Ambrose did not die in a storm." The room did a slow, terrible turn. Winifred's hand went out. It found the edge of the table. She held on. She said, "What?" "There was a storm that night." "Yes, but the storm did not tear the roof off the cabin. I have the man who did it, ma'am. He is my cousin. He works still for Percival Drayton. He was 17 years old that night. He and 2 other men were paid to do it, to force the Ambrose family off that piece of land before the spring surveys could be filed. They were told the house would be empty." She could not speak. "They did not know." Elias said that Rebecca Ambrose was in the house. "They did not know she was with child. When they realized what they had done, they ran. My cousin has drunk himself half to death for 8 years over it. 6 weeks ago, on the 3rd day of a binge, he told me, and I wrote it down, and I signed my name, and I signed his name. I have his sworn statement in this satchel." He tapped the leather satchel. Winifred stared at it. Elias said Percival Drayton did not know his men had killed anyone that night. "Not at first. He knows now. He has known for 6 years. He has kept my cousin close to hold this over him. My cousin was going to die of it eventually on a whiskey bottle, and no one would ever have known." Winifred said very quietly, "Why are you telling me this?" Elias Barrow looked at his hands. He said, "Because 6 days ago, Percival Drayton sent a man to kill me." She looked up. He met her eyes. He sent a man because I was starting to ask questions inside the office, because I was starting to look at ledgers I was not supposed to look at, because I wanted to know what happened to my cousin's mind, and I found out and I could not unknow it. My employer figured out what I had figured out. He does not leave men alive who figure things out, ma'am. So you ran. I ran, yes, but I did not run empty-handed. He opened the satchel. He took out a leather-bound notebook. He put it on the table between them. He said, "This is 3 years of orders. Every fence cut, every cattle drive, every filed inquiry, every man he paid and how much, every judge he tried to influence, every letter he wrote to Cornelius Rook. 2 of the pages, ma'am, are in his own handwriting, signed." Winifred stared at the notebook. She said, "Why me?" "Because you are the only person in this territory who understands what to do with this." Mr. Barrow. Yes. You could have ridden into Copper Hollow. You could have gone to a marshal. I could have. I would be dead in a jail cell inside of 48 hours. Drayton has men everywhere. I do not know which lawman is bought and which is not. I know one thing. I know that if I bring this to the Ambrose homestead openly, Drayton will burn that homestead to the ground within a week and blame the fire on trappers. I know that if I take you, ma'am, and if I keep you exactly 9 miles from home in a cabin, nobody knows, and if I let the news spread through Copper Hollow that Ephraim Ambrose's woman has been taken by a Drayton man, then Percival Drayton will believe his own hand did it. He will not act until he understands who acted. That buys us 4 days, maybe 5. Long enough for the lawyer you wrote to in Colorado Springs to reach this territory. Long enough for you to bring everything together in one place. Winifred looked at the door. She looked at Elias Barrow. She said, "Ephraim will not wait 4 days. No, ma'am. That is why I need you to write him a letter, right now, and I need you to fold it. And I need you to write on the outside of it, 'Do not open until you have read this side first.' And then on that side you will write, 'I am not taken. I am kept. Trust me. Come to me on the 4th day at first light with your brothers and your father's rifle. Not before. Not before Ephraim." She stared at him. She said, "How did you know about his father's rifle?" Elias Barrow almost smiled. "Ma'am, if you know your enemies, you know their prized things. Percival Drayton knows a great deal about Ephraim Ambrose. So do I." Winifred picked up the pen. She wrote the letter. Elias Barrow rode out at dusk with the letter in the same satchel that held the notebook that held 3 years of Percival Drayton's crimes. He rode to the halfway rock above the Ambrose Creek. He tied the letter to the rock with a leather cord. He wedged a red kerchief in a branch above the rock so the letter could be seen. He rode north into the trees without waiting. At just past midnight, Ephraim Ambrose, who had ridden his bay flat out from the spring house and was on his 5th mile of a search that was going to end in blood, saw the red kerchief. He climbed off his horse. He read the letter. He read it 3 times. He sat down in the snow beside the rock. He put his face in his hands. His brothers who had ridden with him sat their own horses 10 feet away and said nothing. Then Ephraim stood up. He wiped his face with the back of his glove. He said, 4 days. She said 4. Josiah on his horse said, "F. Josiah, we have 4 days. Yes. Then we ride home and we get ready." Ephraim Ambrose looked at his brother in the moonlight. He said, "Yes." They rode home. Ephraim did not sleep for 2 nights. He sat at the table in the cabin. He read every page of every letter Malachi Ambrose had ever written to Obadiah Ashton. He read the cedar box empty. He read it twice through. He read the passages about Rebekah as if he had never seen his own life before, because he had not. Because Winifred Ashton had walked into his cabin and had opened a locket, and everything he thought he had understood about his own past had turned out to be a room with a door he had not yet opened. Now the door had been opened. By a man in a trapper's cabin 9 miles up the creek. Rebekah had not died in a storm. Rebekah had been killed. His daughter Sarah, 6 days old, had died in the cold of a house whose roof had been torn open on purpose by men whose employer had gone to bed that night in a warm house in Denver. Ephraim Ambrose sat at his father's table with his father's letters spread out in front of him, and something in him that had been asleep for 8 years opened its eyes. Not rage, something clearer than rage, something colder, something that had a shape. He looked at Gideon, who sat across from him. He said quietly, "I will not kill him." Gideon looked up. "I know. Winifred would not have me kill him." "No, I am going to do worse than kill him." Gideon Ambrose, 32 years old, hardest and quietest of the three brothers, looked at his older brother across the table by the low fire in the middle of the second night. He said, "What are you going to do, Eve?" Ephraim said, "I am going to make him watch his life come apart the way he watched ours come apart. And I am going to do it inside a courtroom." Because Winifred said, she said, "That is how you do it. That is how you finish something." Gideon nodded slowly. He said, "All right." Then he added, and it was the closest thing to a joke Gideon Ambrose had made in 8 years. "Your wife is a dangerous woman, brother." Ephraim looked at Gideon. For the first time in 8 years, Ephraim Ambrose smiled. Not a full smile, just the corner of his mouth, just enough that the scar at his temple lifted. He said, "Yes, she is. God help us all." On the fourth morning at first light, three brothers rode up the creek trail with their father's rifle and two more between them. The snow was fresh, the sky was pale. A raven called once from the top of a pine and did not call again. They came up on the trapper's cabin from the west because Elias Barrow's letter had told them to. They dismounted a quarter-mile out. They walked the rest of the way, Ephraim first, Gideon on his right, Josiah on his left. They reached the door. The door opened before Ephraim could raise his hand. Winifred stood in it. She wore her gray wool dress. She wore her heavy shawl. Her eyes were tired. Her cheeks were thin from 4 days of thin meals and thinner sleep. She looked at Ephraim. Ephraim looked at her. For 4 days he had been rehearsing everything he was going to say. He had rehearsed it on the ride up. He had rehearsed it on the walk in. He had rehearsed it standing at the door. He said none of it. He crossed the porch in 2 steps. He wrapped both arms around her. He held her against his chest without a word. And Winifred Ashton, who had been strong for 4 days, who had written letters and kept her wits and slept only 3 hours a night, with one eye on the door and one hand near the poker by the stove, finally let go. She cried into his coat. She cried the way a woman cries when she has been holding it for a very long time. Ephraim put his hand on the back of her head. He did not say a word. He held her. Behind them, Elias Barrow stood up from the table. He kept his hands where they could be seen. Gideon Ambrose looked at Elias Barrow for a long moment. Then Gideon Ambrose walked into the trapper's cabin. He walked to the table. He looked down at the leather-bound notebook that was open on the table. He read one page. He read another. He looked up at Elias Barrow. He said, "Mr. Barrow, Mr. Barrow, I do not know yet whether I like you." "No, sir. But I am going to trust you, for today, because my brother's wife is standing on that porch alive and because she says you saved her life." "Yes, sir. If she is wrong." "I understand, sir." "Good." Gideon Ambrose closed the notebook. He tucked it under his arm. He said, "Josiah, help him pack. We are all going home now." Nathaniel Ferrers stepped off the noon stage in Copper Hollow on the 7th of December, 1878. I was a small man, 61 years old. He wore a gray coat that had seen 3 territories and 2 wars, and his boots were creased in the exact places that told you he had been in a saddle more than he had been in a courtroom, and he carried one leather case that was worn smooth at the corners, like something a river had polished. He shook Ephraim's hand. He looked at Winifred. He said, "You are the woman who wrote the letter." "Yes, sir." "You cited the Whitmore ruling in the 3rd paragraph." "Yes, sir." "How did you find the Whitmore ruling?" "I read the transcript twice." "When?" "In the winter of 1875, in the Kansas City Public Library." Nathaniel Ferrers looked at her over the tops of his glasses. He said, "You will forgive an old man, Miss Ashton, but I am going to ask you a question, and I am going to ask it only once." "Yes." "Who taught you the law?" Winifred looked up at him. She said, "No one taught me, Mr. Ferrers. I taught myself because someone had to." Nathaniel Ferrers stood in the cold middle of Copper Hollow's one street, and he looked at this woman for a long moment, and then he did the smallest, oldest, gentlest bow. He said, "Then I am at your service, ma'am." He walked with them to Ruth Calloway's general store. Ruth Calloway, who ran the store and had opinions about everything, and had shortened them by half since Winifred first came off the stage, threw open the door of her back room without being asked. She said, use it as long as you need. I will bring coffee every hour." She did. For 11 days, the back room of Ruth Calloway's general store became a courthouse. Nathaniel Ferrers worked at Ruth's little writing table. Winifred worked beside him. Gideon read and reread every page Elias Barrow had brought and cross-checked every claim in it against Malachi Ambrose's letters and against the county records that Ruth Calloway had gone to Denver herself to fetch. Because she said, and this is a quote, "I have been in this town 41 years, and I have not once left it for less than my mother's funeral, but I will get in that stage tonight for that girl." Elias Barrow slept in the loft above Ruth's store. He did not go out during the day. He wrote his own statement 3 times longhand in a spidery, clear handwriting that Nathaniel Ferrers said was the neatest witness statement he had seen in 15 years. Old Barnaby Whitaker's son Elias came back on the 11th day. Winifred had written to a man she did not know, a pastor in Denver named Ephraim Coleridge, who ran a boarding house for men without families. Winifred had written to him because his name had been in one of Malachi Ambrose's letters as a young missionary Malachi had once helped feed for a winter. She had asked him if he could find one Elias Whitaker of Copper Hollow, Montana, and if he could stand as guarantor of that young man's debt for 1 week only until arrangements could be made. Pastor Coleridge had written back. He had written back that he had found Elias Whitaker, that he had paid the debt from the poor box himself, that he expected no thanks, that he only asked to be remembered in prayer. Elias Whitaker arrived on the noon stage on the 11th day. Old Barnaby Whitaker met him in the street. He did not speak. He could not. He put his hands on his son's face. He held them there. Then he turned and looked at Winifred Ashton standing on the porch of Ruth's store in her gray wool dress in the cold December sun, and Barnaby Whitaker went down on his knees in the middle of the street of Copper Hollow, Montana, and he put his forehead to the frozen ground. Ruth Calloway said, "Oh." Then she went inside so that no one would see her cry. The hearing was set for the 14th of December. Percival Drayton arrived on the morning of the 13th in a Denver-built carriage with 2 attorneys and a personal secretary who wore a bowler hat and a gold watch chain. Percival Drayton was 58 years old. He was smaller than Winifred had expected. He was thicker through the waist than the newspaper drawings had suggested. He wore an overcoat with a fur collar that in this country marked him more surely than any brand. He saw Ephraim Ambrose on the street. He crossed to him. I extended his hand. He said, "Mr. Ambrose." Ephraim did not take the hand. Percival Drayton let his hand drop without a visible reaction. He said warmly, "I understand there has been some confusion between our people. I want you to know that I have come personally to see it resolved." Ephraim said, "Mr. Drayton." "Yes, you are a small man." Percival Drayton blinked. "I beg your pardon." I said, "You are a small man. I have carried you around inside my head for 6 years as a mountain, and you turn out to be 5 feet and 6 inches of coat and shoes." Percival Drayton's smile went flat around the edges. He said, "I do not know what you have been told, Mr. Ambrose." Ephraim Ambrose looked past him to where Winifred stood on the porch of Ruth Calloway's store beside Nathaniel Ferrers. Winifred wore her navy blue traveling dress, the one she had worn off the stage on her first day. She was watching him. Ephraim looked back at Percival Drayton. He said, "I have been told the truth, Mr. Drayton, for the first time in my life, and I would like to invite you to hear it too, in court, tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. He touched the brim of his hat. He walked past Drayton. He walked up the steps of Ruth Calloway's store. He stopped in front of Winifred. He did not touch her, not in the street, not with the whole town watching, But he looked at her, and his gray eyes did something they had not done in 8 years. They shone. The courtroom of Copper Hollow, Montana held 40 people on a good day. On the morning of December 14th, 1878, it held 93. Every rancher from the Silver Pine Ridge Valley had come. Their wives had come. Their sons had come. Ruth Calloway sat in the front row with her arms crossed, in an expression that dared anyone to try anything. Old Barnaby Whitaker sat with his son, and Elias Whitaker held his father's hand and did not let go for the whole 3-hour hearing. Wade Boone, sheriff of Copper Hollow, sat at the back. He wore a clean shirt for the first time in 6 months. He looked like a man who had been up all night, and he had been. Percival Drayton and his 2 Denver attorneys sat at the plaintiff's table. Nathaniel Ferrers, Winifred Ashton, and Ephraim Ambrose sat at the defense table. The territorial judge was a man named Judge Fletcher Ainsworth, 68 years old, from Helena, who had a reputation for reading every page of every filing put in front of him and for not being impressed by expensive coats. The hearing began at 10 o'clock. At 10:15, Nathaniel Ferrers laid the Whitmore precedent in front of the judge. At 10:42, the judge asked Winifred Ashton to take the stand. She stood up. She walked to the front of the courtroom. She sat down in the witness chair. She smoothed her navy blue dress. She looked at Judge Ainsworth. He said, "Miss Ashton." "Yes, Your Honor." "I am told you have been the primary compiler of the evidentiary record in this matter." "Yes, Your Honor." "I would like you to walk me through it." She did. She walked him through it for 84 minutes. She began with the 2 informal boundary inquiries Percival Drayton had filed against the Ambrose homestead in the previous 18 months. She showed the identical language. She showed the template. She laid the Whitmore filings alongside them, word for word. She walked him through the surveyor's report Cornelius Rook had filed 12 days ago. She showed the methodological errors. She showed the exact places where the survey deviated from the recorded boundaries in ways that were not accidental. She laid Malachi Ambrose's 1857 letter on the bench. She read the paragraph aloud. "Asked me to sign a map that was not true, and I would not, and now I am home, and I will not go back." She looked up at Judge Ainsworth. She said, "The man who asked Malachi Ambrose to sign that false map, Your Honor, is sitting at the plaintiff's table." The courtroom went very still. Percival Drayton's lead attorney rose to object. Judge Ainsworth said, without looking at him, "Sit down, counselor." The attorney sat down. Winifred kept going. She laid out the pattern of harassment across 5 ranches. She showed the timeline. She read from Elias Barrow's notebook. She read a page in Percival Drayton's own handwriting dated April 1878 that instructed one Cornelius Rook to quietly discourage the Aldrich family in whatever manner he sees fit. She stopped. She lifted her head. She said, "Your Honor, 2 nights ago a man named Elias Barrow gave me a sworn statement. It is signed. It is witnessed. It is in the record before you." Judge Ainsworth said, "The statement regarding the events of January 1871. "Yes, Your Honor. I have read it." The courtroom did not breathe. Winifred said quietly, "Then Your Honor already knows that Rebecca Ambrose and her infant daughter Sarah did not die because of weather." Judge Ainsworth was silent for a full 10 seconds. Then he said, "Miss Ashton, please continue." She continued. She continued for another 22 minutes. She did not raise her voice once. When she was done, Judge Fletcher Ainsworth looked at her over his glasses for a long moment. He said, "Miss Ashton, you have compiled one of the most thorough evidentiary records I have seen in my career on the bench." Winifred said, "Thank you, Your Honor. I understand you have no formal legal training." "That is correct." "Where did you learn to do this?" Winifred Ashton looked past Judge Fletcher Ainsworth. She looked at the wall behind him. She looked at nothing at all. She said, "In a boarding house on the south side of St. Louis, Your Honor, in the winter of 1875. Because someone had to." Judge Ainsworth nodded slowly. He said, "You may step down." She stepped down. Nathaniel Ferrers called his next witness. He called Sheriff Wade Boone. The courtroom stirred. Wade Boone stood up from the back row. He walked forward. He was not a young man. He walked slowly. He wore his badge for the first time in 6 months in a way that suggested he had polished it that morning with a piece of soft cloth and had thought about it while he did it. He took the witness chair. Nathaniel Ferrers said, "Sheriff Boone, please tell the court about the letters you have kept." Wade Boone reached into his coat. He drew out a small oilcloth packet. He set it on the bench. He said, "Your Honor, Percival Drayton first came to my office in April of this year. He offered me $200 a month, cash, for my cooperation in matters concerning the Silver Pine Ridge Valley." The courtroom made a sound. Wade Boone did not raise his voice. He said, "I did not take the money, but I did not refuse it either. I let him think I had taken it, and every month from April through November, one of his men handed me $200 in an envelope. And every month from April through November, I put the envelope in a strong box under my kitchen floor, untouched. Every letter he sent me, every message, every instruction, all of it, under my floor, waiting." Percival Drayton's lead attorney was on his feet. He was shouting. Judge Ainsworth said, "Counselor, sit down, or I will have you removed." The attorney sat down. Nathaniel Ferrers said, "Sheriff Boone, why did you keep them?" Wade Boone looked at his hands. He said, "Because 10 years ago, my wife Mary Boone died of consumption. She caught working in the Drayton silver mine outside Butte. She was 29 years old, sir. She had gone to work in that mine because I had a bad year with the ranch, and I could not feed our children. She was there 4 months." He looked up. He looked at Percival Drayton at the plaintiff's table. Percival Drayton was not looking back. Wade Boone said, "I have been waiting 10 years, Mr. Drayton, to hand these letters to a judge." He turned to Judge Ainsworth. He said, "Your Honor, I would like to enter them into the record now." Judge Ainsworth said quietly, "So entered." At 3:18 in the afternoon, Judge Fletcher Ainsworth rendered his ruling. He invalidated Percival Drayton's boundary survey on the Whitmore precedent. He struck the 2 preliminary inquiry filings from the territorial record as fraudulent. He ordered restitution to 5 ranches in the Silver Pine Ridge Valley for damages incurred during the previous 18 months. He ordered the immediate cessation of Drayton Silver Consortium operations within a 20-mile radius of Copper Hollow pending a federal investigation. Ha then said, and here his voice went very quiet, and every person in the courtroom leaned forward without knowing they were leaning. "I am also ordering as of this moment that Percival Drayton be held in this jurisdiction pending arraignment on charges related to the events of the 9th of January, 1871 in the Silver Pine Ridge Valley. Those charges are being drafted at this time by federal authorities. Bail is denied." Percival Drayton stood up. His mouth opened. His lead attorney put a hand on his arm. Percival Drayton looked across the courtroom. He looked at Ephraim Ambrose. Ephraim Ambrose looked back. He did not smile. He did not need to. The courtroom exploded. Ephraim did not move at first. He sat at the defense table with his hands folded, and he let the noise wash over him for a long moment. He heard Ruth Calloway crying. He heard Josiah laughing. He heard Gideon somewhere close, quiet breathing. Then he looked at Winifred beside him. She was very still. Her hands were folded on the table. Her eyes were on the front of the courtroom. She had not moved either. He said softly, "Winifred." She turned her head. He said, "It is over." She said, "Yes." "Rebecca." "Yes." "Sarah." "Yes." She reached under the table. She took his hand. She held it. He looked down at her hand in his, and he understood in a way he had not understood in 8 years, that a man could survive what he had survived and still find that his hand fit inside another hand. He said quietly, "Winifred Ashton." "Yes." "Will you marry me?" She almost laughed. She almost cried. She did neither. She said, "Ephraim Ambrose, I already agreed to that 6 weeks ago by post." "Yes. But I would like very much to hear you ask." He turned to her. I was 35 years old. He had not felt his heart do the thing it was doing in 8 years. He was not sure he remembered how to do this. He was not sure he was doing it right. He did not care. He said, "Winifred, I do not know if I will be good at this. I have forgotten how. And even before I forgot, I do not think I was ever very good. But I would like to spend the rest of my life trying. Slowly and badly and better every year, if you will let me. She said yes. He said yes. She said yes. Josiah behind them said, "Oh, thank God." And Ruth Calloway said from somewhere in the middle of the crowd, "About time." Spring came late to Silver Pine Ridge in 1879. The snow held on the north slopes until the middle of May. The creek ran high and silver over the pale stones. The first crocuses came up along the south fence line on the 17th, small and purple and perfect, and Winifred Ashton, walking out to the spring house, with her bucket on the 18th morning, saw them and stopped. She knelt down in the wet grass. She looked at them for a long time. Behind her, boots crossed the porch. She did not turn. She knew the sound of his boots now. She could pick them out from any of the three brothers. She could pick them out from any man on this mountain. He stopped behind her. He said, "Winifred, Ephraim, you are going to catch cold." "I am not." "You are on wet grass." "I know." "Come inside." She stood up. She turned. I was in his shirt sleeves, rolled to the elbows. There was pine sap on his sleeve because there was always pine sap on his sleeve, and his gray eyes were softer than they had been 6 months ago, and the scar at his temple had faded a little in the spring light. She said, "The wedding is in 3 weeks." "I know. Ruth is making the cake." "I know that too. Josiah is crying about it every day already." "Josiah is Josiah." "Ephraim." "Yes. I have been thinking." "About what?" She reached up. She touched his collar. She adjusted it. She smoothed the wool of his shirt over his shoulder. Because she could now. Because her hand had learned over 5 months to move toward him without asking. She said, "I have been thinking about Rebecca." He did not flinch. That was the thing she wanted him to notice. About himself. That he did not flinch anymore. That he could stand in the wet grass on his own homestead in the spring light and hear his first wife's name in his second-to-be wife's mouth and not flinch. She said, "Would you show her to me?" Show her. There must be a place where she is, where Sarah is. Ephraim was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Yes." He took her hand. He walked her past the barn. He walked her past the corral. I walked her up a small path she had never taken before, that curved away from the yard and into a stand of aspen at the base of the mountain. At the end of the path was a small clearing, 2 headstones, simple, weathered, neither one grand. He had cut them himself, she could see that. From the same pale stone the creek ran over. The larger one said Rebecca Ambrose, 1848 to 1871. The smaller one said Sarah Ambrose, 6 days. Winifred looked at them. She did not cry. She had promised herself she would not cry in Rebecca's clearing. She kept the promise. She said softly, "Hello, Rebecca. Hello, Sarah." She knelt down. She touched Sarah's small stone. She said, "I am going to marry your husband, your papa. I want you to know that I will love him as well as I can. I will not try to fill the place you had. That place is yours. I would only like to make a place beside it, beside yours, if that is all right." Ephraim behind her made a small sound. Not a word, just a sound. She stood up. She turned to him. He was crying. Ephraim Ambrose, 35 years old, widower, mountain man, half-brother of 2, crying openly, in the aspen light, in the spring wind. She stepped into him. She put her arms around his waist. She pressed her cheek against his chest. She said into his shirt, "Ephraim, yes, I love you. I know. I have loved you since the second morning. You said, when you drank the coffee I made." "Yes." "I did not know then." "I did." She looked up at him. I was looking down at her. His face was wet. His mouth was almost smiling. He said, "I saw you kneel beside my old dog on the first afternoon, and I knew. You were 3 days in the north cabin." "I was." Being stubborn. Yes. You are still stubborn. Yes. I love that about you. I know. She almost laughed. She said, "You do not have to say I know every time." He said, "I know." She laughed. She laughed into his shirt. He put his hand on the back of her head. He held her there. He looked up at the aspen leaves moving in the spring wind, and he did not say a thing to Rebecca. He did not need to. Rebecca had already known. For 8 years, Rebecca had already known. And in a small clearing in the Bitterroot country, in the spring of 1879, Ephraim Ambrose stood beside two graves, and he held another woman in his arms, and he understood for the first time in his life that grief was not a wall. Grief was a room, and a man could put a chair in that room and a table. And another person, if she was very careful, could come and sit at the table, and no one who had gone would begrudge it. No one who had gone had ever wanted anything else. He said, "Winifred, yes. Let us go home." Yes. They walked back down the path together. Old Job on the porch of the cabin saw them coming. He thumped his tail. Twice. Which was a lot from Job. They were married 3 weeks later, on the 9th of June, under the biggest pine on the ridge, the pine that Malachi Ambrose had planted with his own hands on the day Ephraim was born. Ruth Calloway had brought the cake up on Wednesday. Barnaby Whitaker had brought a fiddle. He had not played it in 6 years. He played it that day. Badly, beautifully. Elias Whitaker, home for 2 months now, had strung lanterns between the porch posts. Elias Barrow, who was still deciding whether to stay in the territory or ride south, stood in the back and did not take his hat off, though he did hold it in his hands. Gideon Ambrose walked Winifred out from the cabin, because she had asked him to. Because Gideon had been the one who found the letters in the cedar box. Because Gideon had been the one who read the photograph in her locket. Because Gideon had been in his quiet way the door. Josiah Ambrose stood as his brother's best man and cried like a boy for the whole 10 minutes of the ceremony. Nathaniel Ferrers, who had ridden up from Colorado Springs on his own animal because he said he wanted the exercise, presided in his gray coat. He had been made a temporary marriage commissioner for the day by a friendly territorial judge. He had insisted. He said the words, "Ephraim said I do. Winifred said I do." Ephraim slid a small gold ring onto her finger. The ring had belonged to his mother whose bedroom Winifred had slept in for 8 months. Winifred slid a small gold band onto Ephraim's finger. The band had belonged to her father. Dr. Obadiah Ashton had worn it every day of his adult life. She had carried it in her trunk from Ohio, wrapped in a piece of the same oilskin that had held her Whitmore folder. She had never told anyone she had it. Not until that morning, when she had put it on the small table by the fire and had let Ephraim see it. And he had picked it up, and he had looked at it, and he had said softly, "May I?" She had said yes. He had said, "Are you sure?" She had said, "My father sent me here, Ephraim. He would like you to have his ring." They said the words. They kissed. The whole ridge cheered. Old Job on the porch thumped his tail 3 times, which was more than he had thumped his tail in years. That night, after the last of the guests had gone, after Ruth Calloway had folded her tablecloths, and Barnaby Whitaker had put his fiddle back in its case, and Nathaniel Ferrers had ridden off with a lantern, and Elias Barrow had disappeared quietly into the trees the way he always did. After Gideon had banked the fire in the main room and gone up to the loft. After Josiah had wept one more time on the porch and gone up after him. Ephraim Ambrose sat by the fire with his new wife. He did not touch her at first. He was learning to do this again. He had spent 8 years being alone in his own body, and he was 35 years old, and he was not going to rush anything. Because Winifred Ashton had walked into his cabin and had opened a door in him that he had thought was nailed shut, and he was not going to force any part of what came next. He sat beside her. He held her hand. He looked at the fire. He said, "Winifred." "Yes." "Tell me about your father." She looked at him. Her eyes shone. She said, "What do you want to know?" "Everything. Start at the beginning. Start with when he first met my father in the summer of '52. Start with the arrow in my father's thigh outside of what is now Bozeman. She almost laughed. That is a long story. We have time. We have all our lives. Yes. She curled up against his side. She began at the beginning. The fire moved on the hearth. The old dog Joe breathed in and out at their feet. Outside the mountain rose black against a sky full of stars, and the wind came down out of the pass in the pine at the top of the ridge. The pine that Malachi Ambrose had planted on the day his first son was born moved in the wind the way a father moves when he is watching something he had waited a long time to see. And in a small cabin in the Bitterroot country in the year 1879, a man who had thought his heart was buried and a woman who had thought her hope was spent found out slowly together, evening by evening, that a heart was not a wall. A heart was a house, and a house, no matter how empty it had been, could always be